next to the last story tonight is called Ash, Glass, Bones, and Bloomies, written by Karen Malfera. Karen, where are you? Karen teaches English at San Diego City College. She was born in the Bronx and raised by mentally ill parents, a schizophrenic mother, and a brilliant alcoholic bipolar father. She is currently working on a memoir about her search for understanding and forgiveness in the wake of her mother's death, and her journey from being silenced as a child to now claiming her voice. And here to perform Ash, Glass, Bones, and Bloomies is Jennifer Scibetta.
She didn't tell anyone when the bleeding began. They refilled her more than a dozen times. I flew back to New York right after they discovered the cause of the bleeding, the cancer she wouldn't acknowledge, so convinced someone had placed glass in her uterus. Certainly it couldn't really be uterine cancer. What do the doctors know, Karen? It's glass. Glass in my uterus. Who would do such a thing? Who would put it there? She gazed at me with an expectant look as if I knew the answer. I, her only child, was the only person who'd ever actually been inside her uterus. Did she mean to suggest something about me? Us? The nature of our relationship? Her psychosis had manifested shortly after I was born, possibly triggered by the hormonal changes associated with childbearing. Yes, perhaps it was me who left the glass in her uterus, the cancer that would drive her mad, the cancer that would kill her. She pulled up her hospital gown and told me to look, see how they packed her. But I refused to look at the life seeping out of her, out of the place from where I began. Blood is what connects us. The doctors assured me there was still time, plenty of time. Instead, there were a pair of unexpected late-night phone calls, permission to intubate, followed by we did everything we could. It was over, and I wanted to be able to cry. I should cry. But the tears, they were long gone. My wife, Lori, and I made quick arrangements to fly to New York from San Diego, have my mother's remains cremated, and hold a memorial service. Our time in New York would be brief, so we had to settle for less than usual. We had a meeting with a jovial funeral director at a Burger King in the Bronx before I went to the hospital to collect my mother's few personal belongings. And I also needed to see her, to witness, to lightly touch her cold cheek, to convince myself this was real, to say goodbye. A few days later, when the funeral director handed me my mother's ashes, bagged and packaged with a proper certificate in a sturdy sky blue cardboard box decorated with pictures of fluffy white clouds, I was surprised. They were much heavier than I imagined. My mother spent her last few years at an assisted living facility, and we held her memorial service in their chapel. That was easy enough, but when the minister asked what I planned to say to the congregation, my mother's friends, her smoking buddies, it hit me that it was my job, as the only child, to write up some sort of eulogy to honor my mother's memory. There was no one else. So I had to find a way to look back in time and dwell in memory, dig up the bones of the past. It was odd that I should be the one to tell others who this woman really was. We had been estranged for years, and were only back in touch for a few short ones before she died. I always wished I had known her before, when she was whole, rational, but I only caught glimpses of that woman. She never stayed with me. We claimed it was my father who abandoned us, who walked out of the house with packed suitcases. But it was she. the sane one who abandoned me. She left me in the care of the other one, the damaged one, the one who so often fell victim to deep bouts of depression, wild fits of sudden rage, and unpredictable periods of paranoia. At the well-attended memorial service, I couldn't bring myself to sing my mother's praises. It had been difficult enough to write what I had the evening before. I told the minister of our troubled relationship, and she kindly offered to read what I had written to those gathered in the chapel. I wrote of my mother's beauty, and her fashion sense, and her addiction to Bloomingdale's, and Elizabeth Taylor look-alike. Some said, and there certainly were similarities, down to the well-placed mole on her cheek. But despite her natural gifts, she religiously applied Revlon makeup, pancake batter thick in front of her well-lit mirror, and always made sure her towering beehive, the hairdo she sported throughout much of my childhood, was perfectly cemented in place before ever venturing out of the house. She attended the Barberjean School of Beauty and developed a taste for fashion and a passion for Bloomingdale's, her happy place, where she bought her clothes, even when we were on food stamps. Although she did occasionally go slumming at Macy's or Lord & Taylor's, she was infatuated exclusively with Bloomies. I suppose the larger the markup, the greater the validation of her good taste. Rich fabrics, silk, satin, velvet, lace, and especially fur beckoned to her. She had a mink stole for special occasions and a fox for a hat she wore most every day during winter. Promise me you'll scatter my ashes in the aisles of Bloomingdale's when I die. You can't just walk into a store and promise that's what I want. Sure, I'd say to make her stop. It was a ridiculous idea she reiterated frequently. The minister then read what I wrote about the nervous breakdown. My mother had it shortly after I was born, in the early 60s. Her mental malady was diagnosed as paranoid schizophrenia. Maybe it was just postpartum depression, she said many years later. They didn't know anything about that then. Perhaps it was. The minister chose not to share that at 26, my mother spent time at Creedmoor State Mental Hospital in New York, where she received electric shock therapy, the old-fashioned kind, 21 times. She never spoke of her hospital stay. It was the secret everybody knew. After the service, the minister allowed me to honor one of my mother's requests regarding the disposition of her remains. She had two. One, that her body be donated to science so they could study the glass in her uterus. The other was that her ashes be buried in the facility's garden where she smoked with her peers while dwelling in her happiest memories. One of her smoking buddies came up to me after the ceremony and assured me she was something. Refined, classy, yeah. I could sense a great feeling of loss among them, something that took me by surprise. They had had the opportunity to see the pleasant Anna, her happy persona, the properly medicated one, the one whose company she had deprived me of with rare exceptions. So we planted some of my mother's ashes in the garden. I handed the heavy pale blue box to the minister, and she opened it ceremoniously. Using a plastic spoon, she scooped a portion of ashes out reverently and placed them in a little bronze chalice. She carried it out to the garden, and I dug a small hole in the dirt amongst the discarded cigarette butts. At first I began to pick them out, and one by one, but then it occurred to me that some of them were likely hers. How fitting. I decided to leave some of them there. Once the earth was open, the minister said a prayer, and we committed my mother's bit of ash to the happy garden. But the ceremony wasn't over yet. It had really only just began. There were other places to visit where I needed to scatter some of her ashes. Stories would come back to me as I stood in each place and allowed or willed myself to meander back in time to excavate the secrets buried there. With my Ziploc bag poised next to the hotel sink, I dug my bare hand into her ash. But I was unprepared. I expected soft, gentle to the touch. But bits of her bone pricked my fingertips and insisted upon an intimate connection that I fought so long to deny and believed I had escaped. I thought this process would be easier, that it would be similar to grabbing a handful of confetti then tossing it in the air. But it wasn't that at all. Even after death and cremation, contact with her was painful. Even after 50 years, I still yearned for a mother's tender touch. My grandfather had purchased a home in the Bronx when my mother was 5 years old. She loved that old house and her backyard garden and lived there for most of her life until she lost it to a scam artist. I heard that she was homeless for a while and broke into the house several times after being evicted. So I had to find a way to allow her to reclaim it, at least a piece of it. Standing at the bottom of the steps of the dilapidated, boarded up and padlocked house, my thoughts wandered through its rooms and hallways, replaying the stories, good and bad. Then I reached into my Ziploc bag in my coat pocket and grabbed a handful of ashes and showered them over the Japanese maple she had planted with such pride decades before. You're home, Mom. Although my mother called the Bronx home, her heart resided in Manhattan, where she worked, shopped, dined, and enjoyed plays, ballet, and the opera. Her ceremony would not be complete without a visit to 42nd Street. So Lori and I wandered up and down the street, peering into the theater lobbies, my hand in my pocket. I followed some of the patrons into one of them and stood behind them. Mom, this is as close as I can get you. You're going to have to find your way in from here. After visiting a couple more, we walked up a hill and the wind began to gust. I felt uneasy, as if I were being pushed back, urged to do more. So I reached in my pocket, grabbed a handful of ash, held it up, and released it. There you go, Mom. Enjoy the theater. It was evening now, and we had plans to meet a childhood friend for dinner, so I pulled out my cell to call her. Karen, my friend said. Hi, where are you? I told her I'm in Manhattan, scattering my mother's ashes. There was a long pause. Where? She asked in a hushed voice. Look, I said, I'm just trying to honor her wishes. No, you can't, she said, knowing where I was headed. But I have to. Please, Karen, she said, I don't want to see you on the news tonight. Really, please, don't get yourself in trouble. I laughed. Of course she was right, but I still felt compelled. Where are you now? She asked. Across the street. I gotta go. Call you when we get back. The light changed as I hung up and we crossed the street and walked right into Bloomies. My hand in my trench coat pocket, cradling the Ziploc bag. I had to find the furs before they closed. I could hear my mother laughing.